Welcome, everyone. I'm going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Abbie Vogler, and I am part of Genoa Healthcare's Pharmacy Solutions team. I am so excited to be with you today for my inaugural webinar and really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to help to hear from us. We do have a lot to cover in today's webinar. First, we'll start with a review of the drug approval process in the U.S. and the new drug approvals in the behavioral health space this year. We will also cover an update to the buprenorphine prescribing regulations. And at the end, we'll take some time to go over the latest and greatest updates as it relates to COVID-19 vaccinations. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple of logistical items. So please feel free to submit any questions that you have at the Q&A icon found at the bottom of your screen. We will save all of the questions for the end of the presentation, but we will be monitoring them as they come in. And then as time allows during the presentation, we'll make sure to answer those at the end. If we aren't able to get to your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar. We will also be asking for your participation in a couple of audience polls. Just so you know, the questions should pop up on your screen in a second window where you can select your response and then hit submit. So with that, we're going to jump into today's webinar. And I just got a question that came through. It should be about an hour in length for today's webinar. There will be a recording. We'll talk about that at the end as well. So if you do need to hop off early, want to make sure you're not going to miss anything, we'll make sure this is all available to you at the end. So let's jump to the next slide. As I mentioned, my name is Abbie Vogler. I am a pharmacist by background. I've actually been with Genoa for about 11 years now, and where I get to spend my time and my passion is really helping build technology and clinical solutions to help pharmacists deliver more medication management services to consumers. So thank you all for the opportunity today. I also have with me two of my esteemed colleagues. First, Bill Wrigley, who is our in-house expert on all things immunization. Bill will join us for the Q&A section of the presentation to help answer any of your COVID vaccination related questions. I also have with me Lindsay Hall, who joins us as the moderator, and she will be helping us with the audience polls and monitoring all of your questions that are submitted throughout the presentation. So thank you, Bill and Lindsay, for your support and help today. Before we jump into the content, I'll just hand it over to Lindsay to review today's first poll. Lindsay?
Thank you, Abbie. And I'd like to just start by gauging the audience's attitudes towards new drug therapies. The question is, what is your approach to adopting new treatment options as they are approved by the FDA? A wait and see approach, try for a few clients or consumers to see how it works, try for all of those who fail current treatment, or adopt immediately as part of my toolbox. I'll just give a minute for everyone to submit their responses. All right, and we can close the poll. So we can see that the group has a large wait and see approach. So hopefully the content with today will help to round out some of the information that you're wanting to hear about drugs that are coming through now. Thanks, Abbie.
Thanks, Lindsay. All right, let's jump right into it. So let me advance the slide here. All right. What I thought I'd actually do before we jump into some of the specifics around some of the new drugs that are available on the market is spend a few minutes over reviewing the drug approval process in the US. This is a very rigorous and nuanced process, complex, lots of different steps. So although I could spend a lot of time on this, I'm going to try and make it brief, but really hit the major milestones for you to give you a sense of all of the different steps that it takes for the drug to go from invention to market. And so it starts with the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and this group essentially oversees the entire process, ensuring that new drugs are effective and that their health benefits outweigh their known risks before they're made available to the public. There are 3 general stages to the approval, and starting with the preclinical, which is really where it starts, where the drug sponsor develops or discovers a new drug compound that then gets moved into animal testing for toxicity. Multiple species are used to gather basic information, and once this process is completed, the sponsor then submits what's called an investigational new drug, or IND, application to the FDA based on that initial testing. It gives information about the drug's composition, the manufacturing process, and then develops a plan for actually testing the drug in humans. That brings us to the clinical stage. So the clinical stage is the second part of the process that involves all of the testing in humans. And the trials are phases 1, 2, and 3 from the most part, and they have a various number of enrollees and have a different focus, mostly on safety, efficacy, and dosing. Phase 1 trials are the smallest. They're usually in healthy individuals, and the goal of this phase is mainly around safety to ensure and identify the drug's most frequent side effects, and often how the drug is metabolized and excreted. Phase 2 is usually in the hundreds in terms of number of patients and focuses on effectiveness. This goal is to really look at how the drug works in patients who have a specific disease or condition, and it's usually tested in comparison to similar patients receiving either a placebo or another drug. As the phase 2 concludes, they really start to put together, the sponsor in conjunction with the FDA, how the phase 3 trials will be done. So the number of typical of patients in phase 3 is in the thousands, and these studies gather more information about the safety and effectiveness of the drug, but also they're studying different populations and different doses, and also looking at how the drug behaves in combination of or in presence of other drugs. Once these clinical trials have concluded, there are several steps for the new drug application or NDA review. So I'll try to hit these briefly as well. But once the trials have been completed, the drug sponsor is ready to submit their new drug application. It starts with an initial review meeting and then the actual submission of the application, which is taking all of the data that has been gathered from both the preclinical and the clinical, and all of the analyses, as well as information about how the drug behaves in the body and how it's manufactured. This is essentially the submission of asking the FDA formally to assign a group to review the drug for approval on the market. Once the FDA has received the application, they have a certain period of time where they can say, yes, we will accept it, and we will assign a review team who then looks at the drug labeling and the facility inspection, and ultimately with the end goal to get the drug approved. Once this is approved, then it becomes available to use in the market. So thinking about the drug approval process and the fact that it does take an average about 12 to 15 years for a new drug to go from that discovery to market, I thought it'd be interesting to show you some historical drug approval rates. And this is a graph from 2011 through 2020. And it's interesting to see that from 2011 to 2019, the CDER, or Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, averaged about 40 novel drug approvals per year. And even looking closer at 2020, despite several challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic, many new drug therapies were approved to help a wide range of patients suffering from many medical conditions, really to give a new sense of hope and in some cases, improved chances of surviving life-threatening illnesses. Many of these new therapies were approved for patients with rare diseases, which span a broad spectrum of disease categories. If we take a closer look at 2020, there were actually over 150 new drug applications evaluated by the FDA, and 53 novel drugs were approved last year. Of those 53, 11 are thought to be potential blockbusters, which essentially means an expected greater than $1 billion in US sales. Another way to look at the drugs is through therapeutic categories. So looking at the 53 drugs approved in 2020, you can see that oncology, infectious disease, and neurology were the top 3. I think it's also interesting to call out that Of these, 40% were actually approved as first in class, meaning that they have mechanisms of action different from those of existing therapies. And these are important because it definitely gives and brings a positive impact or hope for Americans that have a disease where current treatment options are potentially failing them. Also, over half, or 58%, of the drugs approved last year were to treat rare or orphan diseases that is defined as affecting 200,000 or fewer Americans. So let's jump into 2021. So we have some time left in the year, but as of today, there have been 40 novel drug approvals, with the vast majority of them in the oncology or immunotherapy space. I do want to call out one of the more recent and probably the most controversial drugs is Aduhelm for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, which was approved via a fast track designation. Fast track designated drugs essentially have a potential to meet unmet medical needs. And so it really speeds up the drug development, the approval process, by increasing the level of communication between the drug sponsor and the FDA, so that the CDER organization can actually review portions of the application along the way. And interestingly enough, CDER designated 32% of the 2020 drugs, the 53 that were approved last year, as fast-track medications. Now, I'm not going to really speak about Aduhelm today, but just wanted to call that out as something that has gotten a lot of media attention since its approval, and something for you to keep an eye on, especially considering that there are over 6 million Americans suffering from Alzheimer's, and there hasn't been a new treatment option which has the potential to target the underlying cause of Alzheimer's. There is considerable interest in this new therapy option from a cost and clinical benefit, so something to keep an eye on. But for now, let's transition into the medications that we'll take a deeper dive into today, drugs that were approved in 2021 for behavioral health. So the first drug we're going to look at is Qelbree. Qelbree is viloxazine extended release capsules. It's from Supernus, and it was approved by the FDA for the treatment of ADHD in pediatric patients ages 6 to 17 years old. Qelbree is a non-stimulant drug where phase 3 data demonstrated that Qelbree significantly improved patients' results on the ADHD Investigator Symptom Rating Scale compared to placebo. At the end of 6 weeks, those in the Qelbree group saw a statistically significant improvement from baseline scores compared to the placebo arm. So right now, as you can see, it's approved for the pediatric patient population. Qelbree will be seeking an additional indication for the adult ADHD population. It was expected to be the second half of this year. So far, the package insert has not been updated, and so it's something to keep an eye out for as well. Some key takeaways for Qelbree. Again, it is indicated for ADHD patients ages 6 to 17 years old. It is a non-stimulant capsule that can be opened up and sprinkled on applesauce or swallowed whole. Again, keep an eye out for another indication for adult patients with ADHD, and note that there is a black box warning for suicidal thoughts and behaviors with this medication. The next medication we'll cover today is Azstarys. Azstarys is from ChemPharm and is sir-dexmethylphenidate and dexmethylphenidate capsules. This is approved for the treatment of ADHD in patients ages 6 and older. It is a once daily capsule containing immediate release dexmethylphenidate and slower release sir-dexmethylphenidate for the appropriate levels of the active drug to be available in the body throughout the day. It was approved via a specific pathway through the drug approval process, where they were allowed to use the safety and efficacy of the Novartis Ritalin or methylphenidate as its reference product. Additionally, there was a randomized trial that demonstrated Azstarys mean change from baseline according to the SCAMP combined score was statistically significant when compared to placebo. It is a scheduled medication, a controlled substance Schedule II by the DEA, and it became available this summer. So again, key takeaways is that it is approved for patients with ADHD ages 6 and above. It is also a capsule that can be opened up and sprinkled on applesauce or swallowed whole. From a dosing perspective, it's important to take a note and look at how it's titrated. The recommendation is to not substitute other methylphenidate products on a milligram per milligram basis. Also, there is a black box warning for abuse independence. The next medication we'll cover is Alkermes Lybalvi. It's a product containing olanzapine, an antipsychotic, co-formulated with samidorphan, a novel opioid antagonist for the treatment of schizophrenia in adults, acute treatment of manic or mixed episodes associated with bipolar I disorder as a monotherapy or as adjunct to lithium and valproate, and for maintenance monotherapy treatment of bipolar I disorder. The Enlighten-2 study compared Lybalvi-treated patients to patients taking olanzapine alone and found that olanzapine alone had a 57% higher weight gain and also had twice the risk of gaining 10% or more of their baseline body weight compared to patients taking Lybalvi. This is a similar product, including Lilly's Zyprexa, olanzapine, and its generics, and it will be available in several dosage strengths. Where the olanzapine dose will vary. The samidorphan is 10 milligrams within each tablet, and it is once daily. Again, it's indicated for the treatment of bipolar I disorder as well as schizophrenia in adults. It is a once daily tablet, with the samidorphan making it unique in that it reduces weight gain associated with olanzapine. It was just recently approved, and so we are expecting it to be available later this month, if not Q4 2021, but currently it's suggested to be available later at the end of October. Of note, it's also contraindicated in patients taking opioids or undergoing opioid withdrawal, and there is a black box warning with increased mortality in elderly patients with dementia-related psychoses, which is a class effect of the antipsychotics. All right, next is Invega Hafyera, or a 6-month paliperidone palmitate. In November of last year, Janssen actually announced the submission of a supplemental new drug application to the FDA for paliperidone palmitate 6-month injection for the treatment of adults diagnosed with schizophrenia. Hafyera is the first and only long-acting injectable antipsychotic with this twice-yearly dosing regimen. The submission was based on the Route 6 study, a randomized, double-blind, non-inferiority phase 3 study that looked at over 700 adults across 20 different countries, and the data showed non-inferior efficacy of Hafyera compared to paliperidone palmitate 3 months on the primary endpoints of time to relapse at the end of a 12-month period. The safety profile observed for Hafyera was consistent with the studies for Invega Sustenna and Trinza, with no new safety signals emerging. This drug was just recently approved last month, so we are expecting it to be available soon, and through the coverage, expecting a mixture of this drug to be either covered under the medical benefit or the pharmacy benefit, and it will depend on the payer. Again, key takeaways for this medication: it's indicated for the treatment of schizophrenia in adults. It's a twice a year dosing after being adequately treated with Invega Sustenna for at least 4 months, or Invega Trinza for at least 1 3-month cycle. Again, what makes it unique is really that this is the first and only long-acting injectable for schizophrenia with a twice yearly dosing regimen. Availability, we believe, should be later this month. And there is, again, the class effect, the black box warning for increased mortality in elderly patients with dementia-related psychoses. I also wanted to just quickly mention another LAI that has recently had their application accepted by the FDA, and that's Teva, who's partnered to create a new delivery system for long-acting risperidone as a sub-Q injection. The compound, which is currently known as TV46,000, can actually be stored up to 90 days unrefrigerated and is an every 2-month injection rather than every 2 weeks for Risperdal Consta. The acceptance of this application is a big milestone, and Teva does anticipate approval next year. So another example of another LAI for antipsychotics that may be available in the near future. All right, another medication that's not a new drug, but is a unique formulation. This is Brixadi. It's from Braeburn RX. Its unique formulation uses fluid crystal injection depot technology, where upon sub-Q injection, when the solution comes into contact with the tissues, it essentially turns into a gel and releases buprenorphine slowly over a 1 week or 1 month period. It is indicated for the treatment of opioid use disorder. It is something similar to Sublocade and will be part of a REMS system. It does have a similar safety profile to oral buprenorphine, and a couple of other things that make it unique is one, it's not required for refrigeration. It is a sub-Q injection that allows for either once a week or once monthly dosing, and it is currently a controlled substance Schedule III medication. What I thought was interesting about this medication was that it was actually given tentative approval in 2018, given the safety, efficacy, and quality data, but was unable to market in the US due to the exclusivity period for Sublocade. So this summer, Braeburn actually submitted their NDA application, and it was accepted, and there is what is called the PDUFA date, which is set for December of this year. So this essentially means that there will be more of a recommendation from the FDA in terms of approval status later this year. So expect to see that around or near December 15th. Another medication that I wanted to cover is actually not approved yet either, but is interesting to include because of its novel mechanism of action. So ulotaront, or SEP 363865, is being currently studied by Synovion for the treatment of schizophrenia. It is a trace amine associated receptor 1 agonist with serotonin 1A agonist activity. So this medication, it has the novel mechanism of action, which has some unique properties we'll talk a little bit about. The FDA granted this drug breakthrough therapy designation for the treatment of schizophrenia in 2019, and it is currently being studied in a global phase 3 trial for schizophrenia, and there are other indications under consideration as well. So the phase 2 data that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine really helped solidify this drug's breakthrough designation status because of the drug's unique receptor activity. So it is thought to not bind to dopamine 2 receptors or the serotonin 2A receptors, which are thought to mediate the effect of the currently available atypical antipsychotics. Dosing is currently suggested as once daily, though that will be solidified throughout the rest of the trials. And the side effects right now are relatively minor in nature and mostly GI related. There's some small reports of somnolence and agitation, nausea, diarrhea, dyspepsia. But what's interesting is there is no elevation in prolactin levels or impact to weight, cholesterol, or A1C. So overall, at this point, the results suggest that this drug does have promise in treating both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia without the movement disorder or the metabolic impacts associated with the first and second generation antipsychotics. So something to keep an eye on, potential launch in January 2023. Wanted to put this out there just to share the information, as I thought it was a unique medication with this unique mechanism of action. All right, before we move on to our policy update, I wanted to briefly mention some of the alternative treatments that are being looked at for mental health. More and more research is being conducted on what have been historically considered street drugs or illicit drugs such as MDMA, ecstasy, mushrooms, or LSD. These drugs are now gaining attention as effective therapies for several behavioral health conditions, including but not limited to PTSD, depression, substance use disorder, and anorexia nervosa, especially in patients where current treatment options may have failed. Companies like Compass Pathways and Atai Life Sciences, along with a number of well-respected educational institutions such as Johns Hopkins or UC Berkeley, are researching a variety of ways to treat mental health conditions with alternative and psychedelic therapies. So while the clinical trials to date are relatively small, there has been some promising data related to the efficacy of these treatments. And as a pharmacist, it's important that we stay current on what the therapeutic options are that are available, as well as the questions that our patients may have about these therapies. We do anticipate there will continue to be more and more clinical trial data published in the coming years that will really help shape what role these emerging therapies will play in the standards of care. We also do recognize that there are risks to these medications and that they could cause or exacerbate behavioral health symptoms. So given this and the clinical application of these therapies, they are often seen in combination with psychotherapy. All right, so we have gotten through a lot of information related to the novel drug approvals in the US. I am going to briefly transition to an update on the buprenorphine prescribing as it relates to the Controlled Substance Act. And just a reminder as we transition that you can submit your questions in the chat box and we will make sure to be following those along the way. Want to make sure we do have some time for questions as we go. And like I said earlier, if you don't have a chance to get to your question, we will make sure to follow up with you after. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the training exemption for buprenorphine. This was actually updated in April of this year, so it might not be new to everyone on the call today, but wanted to take time to talk through it. We know that, and it comes as no surprise, that there is an opioid crisis in this country. According to data from the CDC, more than 83,000 drug overdose deaths occurred in the United States in the 12 months ending in June 2020. And that was the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a 12-month period. And it was an increase of over 21% compared to the previous year. So effective April 28th of this year, under the Controlled Substance Act, practitioners who are licensed under their state law and who possess a DEA registration are exempt from the certification and training requirements as it relates to prescribing buprenorphine for opioid use disorder treatment. Of course, the goal of this change was to allow more prescribers access to doing so, which would decrease barriers for patients, allowing them to have more treatment access when needed. Just a couple of things to talk through as it relates to this exemption. Practitioners will be limited to treating no more than 30 patients with buprenorphine for opioid use disorder at any one time without having to meet the training and certification requirements. If it's over 30, then those requirements do still stand and must be met in order to do so. The exemption applies only to the prescription of drugs or formulations covered under the X waiver of the CSA, such as buprenorphine, so it does not apply to the use of methadone in OUD. Also, prescribers utilizing this exemption shall place an X on the prescription and clearly identify that the prescription is being used or written for opioid use disorder. Of note, also, you still are required to submit an application designated as a notice of intent, and you still require an XDA to do so. All right, with that, we have made it to our last section of the presentation today. We're going to finish up with a quick overview of the most recent information as it relates to COVID-19 vaccinations. Updated guidance is being released on what feels like a weekly, if not daily, basis. So it's important to keep up with the latest and greatest information available, and we want to make sure to be a good resource of information for you guys today. So we're going to spend a little bit of that time. But before we do so, Lindsay, I'm going to have you help us with our next polling question.
Thank you, Abbie. The question is, are you receiving questions from patients on whether or not they should get the COVID-19 booster? I'll give everyone a minute to respond. Okay, and if we can close the poll, please. Great. Well, we will give you some more information related to the booster today. Take it away, Abbie.
All right. Okay, so just a couple of things I know there's been questions too about if the slides will be available or if we can print those out, and we can make sure to follow up with those afterwards. And like I said, we will be recording this as well. So I want to make sure we're addressing those questions in the chat box. But we're going to jump into the COVID vaccine updates. What I wanted to do is actually just spend a minute as we think about terminology. It's really important that we get this right. So I'm going to try and go through this slowly because I think it's important to articulate the difference. But one of the things as we get into the specific recommendations is to help distinguish the difference between a booster dose and the third dose, as I'm sure you're often hearing both of these terms being used. However, it's important to recognize that the terms booster and third dose are not viewed as interchangeable by the CDC. So immunocompromised individuals receive a third dose as an extension of their primary series, whereas non-immunocompromised individuals receive a booster dose after their primary series is complete. So if there are any questions on that, we can certainly clarify, but wanted to make sure that we spent some time distinguishing the difference between the booster and the third dose. And currently, guidance has been released as it relates to booster doses for Pfizer. So let's review the Pfizer guidance for booster doses now. Individuals who are 6 months out from their last dose of the Pfizer vaccine are eligible for a booster dose if they fall into one of these high-risk groups. So I have 3 groups I'm going to cover here and then an additional on the next slide. So there are 4 groups that we'll cover. The first is patients that are ages 65 years and older. And we know that the risk of severe illness from COVID-19 increases with age. It also increases with adults of any age with underlying medical conditions. And often patients 65 years or plus have these underlying medical conditions. So the first group is patients 65 years of age or older. The second group are 18-year-old individuals or older that are residents of long-term care settings. Because residents in long-term care settings live closely together in group settings and are often older adults with underlying medical conditions, they are at increased risk of infection and severe illness from COVID-19. The third group is patients ages 18 years of age and older with an underlying medical condition. They may receive a booster shot based on their individual benefits and risks. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about the underlying medical conditions, but I also do want to take a moment to refer you to the CDC website where they will keep the most up-to-date information. So as patients come in, if there are questions, that's a great resource to look at what are those qualifying underlying medical conditions. Briefly, examples include CKD, chronic lung disorders like COPD or asthma, dementia, Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity, somebody with smoking history, etc. So for that complete list, make sure to check out the CDC website, and we can be sure to provide links if needed as well. The fourth group I wanted to talk through for Pfizer boosters are individuals 18 years of age and older who are at increased risk of exposure or transmission because of the occupational or institutional setting. So thinking about that, occupations at increased risk include first responders, such as healthcare workers, firefighters, police, and congregate care staff, educational staff, such as teachers, support staff, and daycare workers, food and agricultural workers, manufacturing workers, the U.S. Postal Service and public transit workers, and those working in grocery stores. So boosters are available for these groups that we've discussed that have received Pfizer for dose 1 and dose 2 and must receive Pfizer as the booster dose. So currently, only the Pfizer vaccine is approved to be administered as the booster dose. Now, this is slightly different, and I'm going to shift gears here a little bit to the third dose, which is for immunocompromised patients. So patients or individuals considered moderately to severely immunocompromised may be eligible for a third dose of an mRNA vaccine, Pfizer or Moderna. Now, guidance recommends that the third dose is the same brand as the primary series. So if someone received Pfizer for dose 1 and 2, their third dose should be Pfizer. Similarly, if they had Moderna for dose 1 and 2, their third dose should be Moderna. Also, the third dose should only be administered to immunocompromised individuals if 28 days have passed since dose 2. Again, the CDC has a listing of all of the individuals to how to categorize moderate to severely immunocompromised. I'm going to list out a few examples here, but want to make sure that that's a reference that you can access should any questions come up specific to one of your patients. So those examples include active treatment for a solid tumor or hematologic malignancies, a recipient of a solid organ transplant that's taking immunosuppressants, a recipient of CAR T-cell or stem cell transplant that has immunosuppressant therapy as well, someone with advanced or untreated HIV, or somebody taking immunosuppressants, high-dose corticosteroids, etc. So there's a whole list of those that can also be made available on the CDC website. So hopefully that helps distinguish the difference between a booster dose and a third dose. On the last slide here, before we open it up to question and answers, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about two other areas that we're getting a lot of questions or things that we actually think will have new information soon. So again, this information is up to date as today, but we know that it can change. So keep in mind that for this recording, the recommendations may change when you're watching this. So first, J&J, Moderna, and Moderna boosters are not yet approved. We just reviewed the Pfizer guidance for boosters, but know that J&J, Moderna, and Moderna evidence is still under review. Same with pediatric vaccinations for patients ages 5 to 11. They are not approved. However, Pfizer has just recently submitted data for review. In fact, the FDA announced on Friday 2 upcoming meetings of its Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee to discuss whether or not to authorize emergency use of the Pfizer vaccine for pediatric ages 5 to 11 years and booster doses for adult recipients of the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. The 2 meetings, we have dates set. The committee will meet on October 14th and 15th to discuss the J&J and Moderna boosters. And then the Pfizer pediatric vaccine meeting is tentatively scheduled right now for October 26th. So if typical cadence follows and assuming FDA approval, we expect an ACIP meeting and vote within the week, and then approval from the CDC director shortly thereafter to release any new guidance. So certainly something to keep an eye on, with new information probably available in a handful of weeks. One other area to cover, especially now that it is flu season, just a reminder that it is okay for the COVID-19 vaccine to be co-administered with other vaccines. So if a patient comes in for their flu shot, it can be administered at the same visit. So now is a great time to remind patients to not only get their annual flu shot and take the opportunity to check on their COVID vaccination status or answer any of these questions. We know it can be confusing and we know it changes regularly. So being a good resource for them is certainly something that we want to make sure we are. So if questions do come up within your clinic, please do feel free to reach out to your pharmacist and have our team help answer any of those specifics. So with that, we are now at the question and answer portion of the presentation. Thank you all for listening. I know that was a lot of information. We want to make sure that we are providing some helpful information for you. Before I hand it over to Lindsay to moderate the Q&A portion of this, I just wanted to call out our COVID-19 vaccine inbox, where you can submit any of your questions, whether it be from today's webinar or as guidance changes. Please feel free to use this as a resource. Email us at vaccine@genoahealthcare.com. We watch that and want to make sure that we can respond as quickly as possible to get you the information you need. So that is also another resource that's available for you. With that, I will hand it over to Lindsay to review some of the questions.
Great. Thank you, Abbie. That was a lot of really great content. Thank you all for your questions. I've been trying to answer as we go, and we will do our best to get to everything right now. If we don't get to your question, you will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a response. So I'm going to start with some questions for Bill, because we've had a number of questions related to specifically the COVID vaccine. So to start off, is there any change in dose of vaccine between the booster and the third dose, Bill?
Currently, there is not a change in dosage for the Pfizer booster. And then if we're talking about third dose for immunocompromised, the dose of Moderna remains the same and the dose of Pfizer remains the same. Now, be on the lookout as Moderna booster guidance potentially comes out in the coming weeks. There is potentially a submission of a half dose for Moderna booster, but that has not been approved yet. So not as of today, the dosages are the same for both the Pfizer booster and Moderna and Pfizer third dose in immunocompromised.
Thank you. And this question is related to flu and COVID vaccines. There was a discussion that the CDC recommended that the flu and COVID vaccines must be 30 days apart. Is that accurate?
That's a great question. So initially, when the COVID vaccines came out, there was a guidance to separate COVID vaccines from all other vaccines by 14 days. I cannot recall the exact point in time that CDC changed that guidance, but currently there is no longer a recommendation to separate COVID vaccine from other vaccines, which includes flu. On the CDC webpage, the interim clinical considerations for COVID vaccination, it does talk a little bit about best practices to avoid some of the injection site adverse reactions, but COVID vaccines can be co-administered with other vaccines at this time.
Thank you, Bill. And what are the risks to getting a booster?
So far, there is not any additional guidance around risks or avoidance for a booster versus the risks that existed for this initial series. So, for instance, if someone had history of an anaphylactic reaction to a messenger RNA vaccine ingredient, such as polyethylene glycol, they should defer from getting the vaccine. That's the same for boosters. So, and as far as the side effects, they're seeing the same type of reactions that occurred with first series commonly, injection site reaction, fatigue, kind of what was sometimes called the Moderna or Pfizer blues, that kind of feeling yucky 12 hours after the dose, and then usually those symptoms resolving within 24 hours from vaccination.
Okay, sticking with the COVID vaccine questions. If a patient is fully vaccinated, tests positive for COVID, and is eligible for a booster third dose, how long should that patient wait until receiving the third dose?
That's a really good question. And similar to first series, guidance is if you are actively ill and in your isolation or quarantine period, you should defer vaccination. Once the acute illness has deemed to pass and you are out of your quarantine period, you can resume getting your vaccine according to the standard schedule. Now, there is a caveat in there. If someone received either passive antibody therapy or convalescent plasma as part of treatment for for their COVID infection, those individuals should defer vaccine for 90 days from the treatment. So again, if you got treatment with convalescent plasma or now I blanked on the other the other treatment, the passive antibody therapy, excuse me, you have to wait 90 days to get the shot.
Okay, and I know that we're at time. Just one additional question, and the remaining we will answer offline after the webinar. Will Genoa have enough vaccine for those who are eligible for boosters or third doses?
All right, hit me with a good one to end. So It's a complex answer. I will say that our goal as an organization is to have COVID vaccine for our consumers, our clinic partner staff, and members of the community that our pharmacies are in. However, there are complexities around procurement of vaccine, and we might, an individual site may not have access to each product at any given time. So here's an example of a challenge we're dealing with now as it relates to Pfizer booster. We're often required to order a minimum of 1,170 doses. That's a minimum order to obtain Pfizer vaccine. So let's say we get a clinic with a request to vaccinate 30 individuals. Our site needs to develop a plan for how they're going to use the remaining 1,130 doses. And that can be challenging if it's a small site. So while it's not a no in that case, there just is a lot of planning that happens with our site and at the regional level of, okay, how can we ensure that if we order 1,170 doses, we do everything possible to avoid waste. And so that just highlights how complex it can be at times, depending on the product and the given site situation as to whether we can obtain the vaccine. And also, CDC has been pretty vocal about monitoring providers for waste. So we want to take that seriously and do everything we can to provide the vaccine where it's needed, but walk the line between making sure that we don't have product going to waste.
Okay, Abbie, I'll turn it back to you. Again, I apologize for the questions that we didn't get to, but we will follow up with responses to your other questions.
Great. Well, then I'm just going to take a moment to thank everybody for your time today. It was great to have you here virtually with us. We really appreciate, again, you taking the time out of your busy schedules for this. We hope it's helpful information, and we want to make sure we can be a good resource of information for you. So please do share the feedback on today's webinar with your pharmacy site manager, with the director of operations. We also would love to hear from you on any future topic ideas. If there's something that you'd like us to cover, we are here for you, and we want to be a good resource. So please do reach out to us. Again, we'll answer the questions that have come in. We love the audience participation. We also want to make sure that you have access to our inbox, vaccine@genoahealthcare.com. Should any questions related to COVID-19 vaccines, flu vaccine clinics that we have going on right now, please do reach out, and we'll make sure to get you to the right resource for answering any of your questions. Again, a recording of this will be sent out. It will also be available on our website, so please be sure to also share it with colleagues. With that, we'll close up everything for today, give you about 10 minutes back in the hour, and thank you again for your time and your questions today, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.